Good morning. I see people are starting to jump on the webinar this morning. We'll give it a couple minutes to let everyone log on. This is Ariel from MACMA. I will be on the webinar today with Carol.
And this is Carol. I'm here as we're getting used to this new way of doing presentations. So we're looking at the number. We see there's 37 people, 38. This is kind of like, I don't know, a game show of some sort. Is there a prize, Ariel, at the end?
It's kind of exciting. Yeah, if we can hit 40, there's a prize. So let's just hope that happens.
Okay.
We're close. There we go.
There we go. Let's start at 40. How about that? So we would really like to welcome you guys for deciding to spend 3 hours of your really, really busy week to talk about separation and loss. I know it's a topic that people have been thinking a lot about because of recent events, but it's also a topic, I think that as the more we talk about it, the more sensitized we'll all get to how it happens all the time with young children and families. So we're going to get started. Now we're up to 43. This is very exciting. Okay, so we're going to give you a little housekeeping information. First is I have control of the screen so that I can make things happen. There is a chat function. Ariel, can you explain that, please?
Yeah, so if you look at the bottom of your screen, you should see a toolbar, and there's a spot that says chat. If you click that open, there's a way for you to chat all panelists. I will be moderating today, so I'll be able to take all of the questions from there, and I will interrupt Carol as we have questions come in to get those answered for you. So feel free to use the chat option to all panelists, and we will get your questions answered.
And also, I'd like to invite you to make comments as well. They don't have to be questions. But if you're just having a reaction and you want to send that in, that would be great, because given that we don't see each other, it's hard to do this in an interactive way, which is the way we all prefer, I think. So please feel free to just write, and then Ariel will be your mouthpiece. Right, Ariel?
Yes, I am here.
There we go. Okay. So I'm thinking you guys saw this introduction when you were wondering about coming to do this webinar. And I started off by talking about an old film, Grief, Apparel, and Infancy, which was made in the 1940s. And the reason it was so important, and the reason that I'm referring to it now, is because it somehow did something to shake up people's understanding of what they were already seeing. It's not like children weren't reacting to separation, but the lens through which people were looking at young children made them discount what they were seeing. So I'm using that, and I'm using another old film for us to just remember how easy it is for us to see from our eyes at the time that we're in, the time that has certain beliefs about how children are or what emotions are, so that we can really think about what it is that we see now, so that we can talk and understand. So we know much more about the impact of separation and loss now than we did then. When we look at these videos, you might think, how can people not understand this? But there was a belief that children didn't have the capacity to mourn, or that children were just little beings, and what was happening around them wasn't actually affecting them as much as we know it does. So there were natural experiments, there were constructed experiments that help people understand. So what we're going to talk about today is, what are the effects, and how were they denied or obscured or misunderstood for so many years? All right. So while I was doing the research for this, I came across a fascinating piece of evidence, a letter from 1939 from John Bowlby, who many of you know is the originator of attachment theory and the developer of attachment theory, with a series of books called Attachment, Separation, and Loss. Donald Winnicott, who was a British psychoanalyst, and it created many of the phrases that we use now, but we don't think about it, like the holding environment, or a good enough parent, or the true self and the false self. He was instrumental in a lot of changes in the way we think about parent-child interaction. Oh, he also was the originator of the baby is not a person, the baby is only a person with someone. And Emmanuel Miller, also a psychoanalyst who was considered one of the originators of British psychiatry. And so I want to read this letter, which referred to the evacuation of children from London during World War II. The fear was that the bombing that was called the Blitz was going to destroy a generation. And so the recommendation was that all small children should be removed and sent to the countryside without their parents. So here's the letter. Sir, the evacuation of small children between the ages of 2 and 5 introduces major psychological problems. Schemes for evacuation are being thought out, and before they are completed, we wish to draw attention to these problems. There are dangers in the interference with the life of a toddler, which have but little counterpart in the case of older children. Evacuation of older children has been sufficiently successful to show that many children over 5 can stand separation from home and even benefit from it. It does not follow from this that the evacuation of smaller children without their mothers can be equally successful or free from danger. From among much research done on this subject, a recent investigation carried out by one of us at the London Child Guidance Clinic may be quoted. It showed that one important external factor in the causation of persistent delinquency is a small child's prolonged separation from his mother. Over half of a statistically valid series of cases investigated had suffered periods of separation from their mothers and familiar environment, lasting 6 months or more during their first 5 years of life. Study of individual case histories confirmed the statistical inference that the separation was the outstanding etiological factor in these cases. Apart from such a gross abnormality as chronic delinquency, mild behavior disorders, anxiety, and a tendency to vague physical illness can often be traced to such disturbances of the little child's environment. And most mothers of small children recognize this by being unwilling to leave their little children for more than very short periods. It is quite possible for a child of any age to feel sad or upset at having to leave home. But the point that we wish to make is that such an experience in the case of a little child can mean far more than the actual experience of sadness. It can, in fact, amount to an emotional blackout and can easily lead to a severe disturbance of the development of the personality, which may persist throughout life. And then I find this very interesting. Orphans and children without homes start off as tragedies, and we are not dealing with the problems of their evacuation in this letter. End of parentheses. These views are frequently questioned by workers in day nurseries and children's homes, who speak of the extraordinary way in which small children accustom themselves to a new person and appear quite happy, while those who are a little older often show signs of distress. This may be true, but in our opinion, this happiness can easily be deceptive. In spite of it, children often fail to recognize their mothers on returning home. When this happens, it is found that radical harm has been done and the child's character seriously warped. The capacity to experience and express sadness marks a stage in the development of a child's personality and capacity for social relationships. If these opinions are correct, it follows that evacuation of small children without their mothers can lead to very serious and widespread psychological disorder. For instance, it could lead to a big increase in juvenile delinquency in the next decade. A great deal more can be said about this problem on the basis of known facts. By this letter, we only wish to draw the attention to those who are in authority to the existence of the problem. We are very truly John Bowlby, Emmanuel Miller, and D.W. Winnicott. So I find that extraordinary. 1930s was before the evacuation of the children, It was while children being separated from their families in other parts of Britain, in other parts of the world, and completely ignored. So our question is, what is this about? Our challenge as a learning community, to me, mirrors the historical challenge, because we keep thinking about why can't we hear the cry of the child? So in infant mental health, we know that Selma Freiberg, the person who took analytic treatment of parents and children from the office into the home, posed this question: why can't the parent hear the cry of the child? So this is our challenge on the community level. And here were three things I was thinking about, like what gets in our way? The emotions in this discussion. Can we tolerate that? Can we tolerate thinking about the distress of the children, especially if we have our own kids? And can we tolerate the distress of the parents, especially if we're parents? And can we allow ourselves to learn when all of our emotions are activated? All legitimate responses, but highly activated. So that's what I'm going to ask you guys to do, is to manage the distress and the outrage and the indignation as we move forward. We're going to be talking about some of the research that led people to agree with these three people's position in 1939. We're going to talk about what's happening now. We're going to talk about what we can do. Let me see if I wanted to tell you this. So I was telling someone I know about this webinar, and I told her what it was called. She is working to represent parents who are being separated from their kids for reasons of, say, criminal activity. And she said, well, what's separation and loss? And I thought, oh, in our field, that seems pretty self-evident, but then I realized that I needed to have more words to be able to explain to someone who has a different way of thinking, what do we mean by separation and loss? So she said, well, is it all bad? And so my answer was, it depends on the age of the child. And I gave some examples of how an infant who is used to that connection between parent and child during feeding and a certain sense of familiarity, the smells, the touch, the holding, the separation from the child, for the child from that parent is going to be disruptive right away. They're not going to understand what happened, especially if they're at the 8-9 month level where they can tell the difference between who they know and who they don't know. The length of time, of course, a short separation is going to be less harmful than a long separation. I think we can say that. Conditions of separation or of the loss. So how did it happen? What happened? Was it planned? Was it a surprise? Was it violent? Was it peaceful? Conditions while separated. What happened to the child? Where were they? Did somebody pick up the parenting function? And then conditions after separation. Was there actually an opportunity for reunification? What then happened to the child and parent?
Carol, I have a kind of a question, or maybe more of a comment, but I'm curious, when we think about separation and loss, I'm just thinking about the difference between the two, and as a professional, how we kind of think about working with children. When does a separation move to a loss for a child, or kind of this idea of they may be reunified with their parent at some point, but that could be a very significant amount of time, and that could be treated like a loss. So what kind of things do we think about with the difference between the two?
So it's interesting you should say that. I do have in this presentation a quote from John Bowlby, who talks about that the absence of a parent for a young child is just like a loss, just like a death. They don't know the difference. And so part of, I think, what is so hard for both parents and child is each of them adjusts to the separation. The child, if the child is cared for by somebody else, starts to make that connection with someone else, and then the parent shows up, and the parent has to do something to shield themselves from the pain. So That's a really interesting question. When does separation become loss? So what we're going to be looking at is some of the historical stuff around that. There's, because of the researchers that were involved in London at the time of this enormous evacuation, there's a lot of research there that will address some of these questions.
Well, and I think the thing you just brought up that triggered my thoughts is I'm thinking about separation and loss from the perspective of the child, but then as a parent, when does that kind of feel like a loss versus separation from your child?
Well, and that's so interesting is that, you know, we don't see nearly as much written about the parent mind. But one thing that I saw, and especially reading about, again, because there was a lot written about this evacuation of 2 million children from London in the 1940s, and they were gone for a long time, 3 or 4 years. And some did not return. They preferred to stay with the foster parent, and what it was like for the parent to know that your child has been influenced deeply by someone from a different, some of them moved to a different country and then returned, someone from a different socioeconomic level, from a different professional level, from a different cultural level, and then your child comes back to you after having been gone. Now they represent something else. They represent, their very presence represents your inability to prevent the separation, or your going along with the separation for the health of the child. So let's go further and see if some of these are exactly what we're thinking about, Ariel. I'm so glad you brought all this up. So let's see if some of these questions get answered. So we have lots of examples of separation, both historically and presently. Please know that I'm not trying to address everything. That, as I was thinking about this topic and thinking about who would be listening, I know that we only have a certain amount of time and a certain amount of attention. And so what I really did not address is genocidal separation. So I want people to know it's not that we're not thinking it's incredibly significant, but what happened in the Native American boarding schools, what happened with your Aboriginal boarding schools in Australia, what happened during times when families were enslaved and the children were separated deliberately. I am not addressing that, but it's in my mind all the time. Also with children who were conscripted into child labor camps. There's so much that we could talk about. So I did have to narrow down the scope, but please know that those things are in my mind as well. And at some point, maybe we'll do a webinar on massive trauma and how it translates down the generations. So we've got historical examples. Oh, I wanted to mention what that weird one, infant feeding separation was. The infant feeding separation came out of literature from France in the 1700s and 1800s, where at that point, somehow it was decided that nursing babies was not good for them. And so the statistics that I've read, about 90% of babies were sent out to the countryside away from their mothers for wet nursing, which set up a cascade of things, because then the women who were wet nursing just means breastfeeding, right? Wet nursing these babies for hire, then what do they do with their babies? So, but it's fascinating to think about what would be the impact on the society if the huge majority of people were sent away from their mothers during nursing time. The other thing that's down here, hospitalization, is because I know from having talked about this that there are people, and there are probably people in the audience who were born, you know, after the 1970s, who may not know that it used to be strict policy that parents were not allowed in hospital when children were ill. And that was just this rigid policy. We're going to be talking about that in a little bit. Okay, so now we've got present, we've got some of the issues we're going to be talking about today: military deployment, foster care, educational or financial need. There's a bunch of stuff being written about countries where children are staying with grandparents so that parents can go to the city. So one example is in rural China, where something like 20% of the kids are separated from parents because the parents need to move elsewhere in order to have enough money to support the children. But there are high levels of anxiety and depression are being understood as correlated with that. And there's some articles that are in the resource section that you can certainly read if you're interested in that. Incarceration is clearly a current issue. Divorce and custody decisions. It's an interesting way to think about it in terms of separation from children, especially young children, when we think about some of the decisions that are made, ostensibly for the sake of the parent-child, I guess. But when we hear about the specifics, sometimes it's hard to understand. Respite care and residential care, substance abuse and mental health treatment, and our most recent border separation policy. I don't have a noun for that. So some of these separations are from the point of view of the child, and some are from the point of view of the adult. So for instance, under child policies, we would say that being evacuated from a war zone in Britain and also in Finland was for your physical safety, despite having some reservations about their psychological safety. Foster care, the system that clearly thinks it's removal for the child's physical safety. Again, the child may have a different understanding of what's happening for them. Hospitalization, protection against infection. And then we have policies that are driven from the adult point of view that are really just decisions that are made and children are on the receiving end. So the question is, for the lived experience on the inside of the child, is, do intentions matter? So we may intend that this is going to help the child, but on the inside, what's it like for the child? This quote, "What if the only woman you ever loved disappeared without a trace," was actually about, it was about the wet nursing, where babies were with their wet nurses for a year or two, and then they were returned back and never saw them again. So that's a, yeah, interesting consequence. So for today's webinar, trying to narrow down our scope, we're going to be talking about developmental stage and how that affects a child's understanding of separation, or a child's experience of separation. The nature of the separation, like what kind? There are so many variables: planned versus unplanned, ongoing versus intermittent versus ambiguous. There's a lot of separation where we really don't have the answer. Peaceful versus violent, and things in between. We're going to talk about traumatic separation and trauma triggers. So post-separation, what happens on the inside of the child and the inside of the parent, how it affects the parent-child relationship. And then at the end, the risks, safeguards, and the recovery process. Okay. So if we were in live, I'd be saying, does anyone have any questions before we start? So Ariel, are there any questions or comments so far?
Yeah, I think the only comment we have, and it kind of goes back to the reading that you did at the beginning. Someone said it's amazing that what you shared is still very applicable to nowadays. So it's all very relevant to today, and that was in 1939.
Right. And while it was going on, that's the other piece that I keep thinking about. What was happening in 1939? So that's also fascinating, right?
Right. Yeah. I think the part that stuck out to me too is the thought of the age differences. And that part is like, if it's an infant, they seem happy and they're fine, versus an older child.
Yeah. Actually, when I was doing my dissertation research on trauma in preschool children, that was very clear in the historical literature, is that people thought the younger children were fine because they were quiet, they were sometimes mute, they were reserved. The older children were acting out, but the children under 3 or 4 were withdrawn. And so that was considered, being good. Yeah, we've learned a lot since then.
Well, and then we know it shows up and manifests in different ways as they get older. And then we wonder, well, what's wrong now?
Yeah, what happened? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, here we go. So some people might recognize this is one of the children from the Spitz films. It used to be thought not long ago that children were too young to mourn. They didn't have the cognitive capacity to really notice loss, even though they showed distress, but their distress was not meaningful. And they believed that any caretaker could take care of them and they would forget about the missing person. We hear some of that still, that if you don't talk to a child about it, they'll just forget about the missing person, even though there's a lot of research about the internal recognition of that parent-child connection, even when a baby is newborn. So it was a past standard of all the communities, psychology, medicine, education, that young children could adapt to separation or to loss without long-lasting impact. And so it actually was the research and the clinical evidence in these areas, attachment, traumatic stress, brain development, resilience, that changed minds. Like opinions, as we can see from the letter from Bowlby and Winnicott, that isn't enough. We have to actually have the research. So we now know preservation of the healthy parent-child connection is essential. And we know that separation from parents can have lifelong as well as intergenerational effects. And right now there's research looking at, is there an epigenetic effect that actually passes down the stress from separation through the generations? So that's getting ahead of ourselves. So what kind of evidence do we have? And again, one of the reasons that I'm doing it this way is for people not in our field, because they say, well, how do you know? Well, how do we know? So let's take a look. We have a long line of clinical and research evidence. And as you can see from the names, these are all Western researchers. We know that there was also separations and traumas going on around the world. But this is the line that I've got because of the written material that I'm familiar with. So we're going to start with, oh, I'm sorry. Here was my kind of disclaimer. This is too big a topic for us to address all of the things. So we are going to be right in this little loon of the Venn diagram about where traumatic stress, attachment, brain development, resilience all come together. Okay. So in the 1940s, there became this opportunity for these natural experiments. They weren't called that at the time, but they were really groundbreaking work because there were so many kids that they had the opportunity to observe and to interact with. So Anna Freud, the daughter of Sigmund Freud, and her two colleagues were part of a group of people who had the wartime nurseries in Britain. And they had two different groups. They had children separated from the parents during the bombing of London, which was a long period of time. And they also had children raised in concentration camps without parents. That article, An Experiment in Group Upbringing, is one of my all-time favorites and was something that I was introduced to my first year as an undergrad student. And I highly recommend it. Oh, I also have the book I was going to show you, Infants Without Families, which is this very large, old book of Anna Freud's that goes through just what it was like, what the weeks were like with these children. So these are detailed notes about the impact on kids' development, about how they managed without parents, the changes that they had to do, and then how hard it was for them to reunite with their parents after separation. So this evacuation thing was called Operation Pied Piper, which one of the articles I read said that it couldn't have been a parent that named it that, because the story of Pied Piper is that the rats didn't come back. So that was never the intention, but that's what it was called. So the government evacuated 4 million people, a whole lot from London. Some went to homes, foster families, some went to relatives, some went to group homes, some went to nurseries. Some were sent to other countries. Some were with siblings, others were not. It's an amazing thing to think about. Here they are preparing for evacuation with their gas masks. And you can see how very, very little some of these children are. As referred to in the letter, parents know that this is a hard thing to do, and they were maybe not convinced. So there was a lot of influence. Mothers send them out of London, children are safer in the country, leave them there. There was a period of time when the bombing stopped, and so some people brought their children back, but then they sent them out again because it started again. Here's my favorite awful one. Don't do it, mother. Leave the children where they are. And you'll notice that that's Hitler whispering in the mother's ear, take them back, take them back, take them back to London so that they can be bombed. Right? What an amazing poster. So do intentions matter, like safety of child? I have to move my little icon because I can't read this. Oh, there we go. The war acquires comparatively little significance for children so long as, she says sarcastically, only threatens their lives, disturbs their material comfort, or cuts their food. It becomes enormously significant the moment it breaks up family life and uproots the first emotional attachments of the child with the family group. The child experiences shock when it is suddenly, without preparation, exposed to dangers with which it cannot cope emotionally. In reality, it is the very quickness of the child's break with the mother that contains all the dangers of abnormal consequences. Right, so that line, the child experiences shock when it is suddenly and without preparation exposed to dangers with which it cannot cope emotionally. That we see across the board, whatever our heading is for the kind of separation is, how do I cope if I don't have my most deepest support? Okay, now there we go. So what were the long-term results? So there were follow-up studies of older people who had been evacuated as children aged 4 to 6. I did not find one that was looking at children younger than 4. But what they found was that they had significant differences from children who were evacuated older or were not evacuated, and significantly higher incidence of anxiety and depression, higher rates of insecure attachment, higher rates of divorce. So this is, what, 40, 50 years later. Right? And they had some unanticipated results, the disruption of the parent-child relationship. So as one parent wrote, in Operation Pied Piper, the family suffered, but I feel the real losers, as in the legend, were the parents. It was as tough for many as one would expect. Although some wrote of their immense gratitude to the kindly, oh, I'm sorry, this is the person who did the study, the kindly foster parents who had loved and cared for their children. There were far more stories of mothers feeling that they had missed part of their children's lives. This woman wrote in her memoir, the small gallant figures have never grown up in my mind. For the children who returned and eventually took their places were not the same. The break in continuity made them rather appear as an elder brother and sister of the vanished pair. So that speaks to your question about when does separation become loss, right, Ariel? Like from the parent's mind, the break in continuity. Go ahead.
I was just thinking back to that idea of when you talked about loss and the idea that you've lost the person you've known previous to the separation. And so it's maybe a different child coming back to you, or a new relationship that you just aren't familiar with. So the loss of the old relationship, even if the child is still there and present with you.
And the same for the child.
Right.
That old relationship was gone, replaced by something different, and then they return to this strange relationship. So look at this next one. Many years lost. Fathers, often forgotten in the evacuation story, also felt they had lost out. In 1944, Ted Matthews wrote to one of his 4 daughters whom he had sent to America in 1940. Sending you away has been in some ways a tragedy. I still think it was the right thing to do, even though events proved different from our fears. But it has been heartbreaking to miss these years of your lives. We shall meet again as almost strangers. 4 years. Yeah. So when does it go from separation to loss? So the impact on parents, I was just thinking, what can we surmise? What do we know about parents where children are, when they're separated very early, these parents who voluntarily sent their children for their own protection, that disruption in a connection and that ability, just the lived ability to sustain their kids and protect their kids, to take care of their kids, and then disruption of their own self-image as competent caregiver, a sense of failing as a parent, failing as an adult. And then I think you would naturally have to protect yourself from hurt by creating an unconscious barrier. I read in a number of these accounts how the parent was surprised by the child's development, dislike of the traits that represented the foster family, alienation from the child, and that they were constant reminders of the separation. So hard to reconnect. There was a certain percentage of kids who actually just stayed with their foster families and never did return. Sorry, I'm being distracted. So now we're going to move on to, wait, let me just ask, any comments, Ariel, that you're receiving?
I don't see any comments. I, of course, have one more comment.
Please.
I'm just thinking about this idea of threats to children, or what we perceive as danger as a parent, and how hard that has to be to weigh what's more of a danger, and how it takes a lot of reflection to think that maybe we have a threat or a danger that's present, but is it more of a danger or a threat to send them away from us? Mm-hmm. Having to make those really big decisions about what's the bigger threat, to keep them with me in this situation or to send them, and now their development is impacted. And so it's just been coming up for me of this idea of having to make those decisions, and it's still so relevant for parents today, thinking about sending them to foster care or adoption, or staying with family members, and just, many other situations. But
yep, it's so relevant.
There are some things coming in right now, and I haven't quite read them. Let's see. One of the questions, what made the decision to send the children? So kind of this idea.
What or who? Do you mean why were they sending them away?
It says what, but I'm curious. Maybe this idea of who made the decision.
Oh, I don't know, because I haven't looked into it from that. I've only looked into it from the parent-child perspective. But I do know that about 40,000, maybe 45,000 people were killed during the London bombing. And so it was bombed continually for a long time. So I don't know who made the decision, but I think the what was clear, that they were trying to protect the children.
Yeah, and then another, a couple of things coming in similar, saying just it's so heartbreaking to hear this information, and then of course that history is kind of continuing to repeat itself, and that this is still happening to children now. And so I think just a lot of emotions that happen for everyone around this topic. Yeah, and I think that the outrage that people are experiencing is that now we know. What was so fascinating by finding that article, that letter from Holby, is that I thought people didn't know. And now I saw that. And so, but now we know because we have so much research. Yeah. Okay, so we're going to look at, I would kind of want to know how many people have, I suppose we can't do that. Can we do that, Ariel? Can we just ask people? I have one of the Spitz films, but if people have seen it, I don't want to take up their time. Yes. We can ask if people would send in the chat if they've seen it or not. Yeah.
Okay, that'd be great. And if they want to see it again, that's also fine. I wasn't going to show the whole thing, but I do have it's just filmed evidence of a baby being upset and then better, So they took movie cameras back in that day into foundling homes for orphans or for babies whose parents were incarcerated, and sometimes incarcerated because they had had a child out of wedlock. So the punishment was to put them in prison for 3 months or whatever. And what they all knew was that the children were not thriving. They had these different terms: hospitalism, marasmus, what we would call now non-organic failure to thrive, but they didn't know why. They did know how to cure it, though. So this is the film. Did we get any feedback about whether people would
we have more people that have not seen it or would like to view it again?
Okay, I will just show, I'm only showing a portion. Uh-oh, let's start that again. That didn't go. There's no sound to this one, so we can talk over it. Should I read it out loud, or can people see it well enough, do you think? Can you see it well enough, Ariel?
I can see it. It moves a little quickly.
The behavior patterns of the children presented correspond within a reasonable age range to those of all the children in this environment when under the influence of similar circumstances. Any exceptions to or qualifications of the two above statements are specifically mentioned in the explanatory text. Chapter 1, the baby loses its mother. During early infancy, the sum total of the baby's human relations is represented by its mother or her substitute. Here is Jane, who has outstandingly good relations with her mother. Accordingly, she smiles happily, even at strangers like the observer. Nope, it went too far, sorry. That goes on for a long time. If the mother is removed from the baby for a few weeks or months, the loss for the baby is comparable to that of a school child suddenly orphaned of both parents, dumped on another continent in an alien environment where nobody speaks its language and customs and food are foreign. Uh-oh, uh-oh, what happened? Sorry, you guys. The next picture is taken of Jane a few weeks later, 1 week after her mother was suddenly forced to leave the baby in the care of strangers. Jane lies quietly on her back. When approached by the female observer, she looks at her with a bewildered look, searchingly, as if expecting her mother. In this, she is disappointed, and notwithstanding soft-voiced reassurance, the depressed expression on her face deepens and she starts to weep. The male observer's approach elicits a worse disappointment. She weeps with greater violence, attempts to reassure her, finally succeed in quieting her. But another glance at the male observer's face starts her weeping again. Note the despairing expression and the tears, which are unusual at this age. She did not scream while weeping, she only moaned. Jane is not an isolated case. We will show you other children who were similarly separated from their mothers for lengthy periods. Here is an unusually clever child who is always happy to welcome friend or stranger. Its age is 7 months. This is after separation has just begun. Oh no, that hasn't, sorry. I'm just trying to advance it a little bit. A little later, this child, this is within the few first weeks of separation. So that's the look, right? That apathetic look. We see children. At our later visits, the child, by now in its 11th month, lies dejected and withdrawn on its cot. At the approach of the observer, its grief finds vocal expression and it is difficult to assuage it. When the observer leaves, the shock of the separation from mother is reenacted and her grief breaks out anew. He comes back, right? You can't stand it. Still another child who has undergone the shock of losing its mother and who was similarly affected during the 3 months of her mother's absence. Like her head is too heavy to even hold up. I would end this, you guys, but I know that the next thing is coming and I'm afraid I'll go too far. I know it's hard to watch. If the mother returns after an interval of less than 3 months, the recovery is rapid. should the separation last much longer, then a frozen, passive, apathetic attitude becomes generalized. Not even weeping occurs anymore, only a thin wailing, and contact with such children becomes impossible. Such processes are apt to leave lasting changes in the infant's personalities. So lest you worry, I just want to tell you that if the film continues, what you would see is his solution, which is give mother back to baby. And you see those same children who look so depleted come to life. I don't remember the second one, whether that happens, the first and the third for sure. All right, so I know that's hard. And again, if we were in person, we would talk about it. So please write in if you've got something you want to express. So we're going to move to separation in hospital care. So the history was that children were hospitalized for long periods of time, and they would have them only with the institutional caregivers because they believed that parents were carrying in germs from the outside. So they had slow recovery time, high infection rates, high mortality, emotional distress, and despair. And Levy and Bachwin were two of the people that decided to do experiments to see what would happen, and they, against huge protest, to allow parents to be on the ward. Their solution was give parent back to baby. And they did an experimental design, which was, as I said, highly controversial. And the results were clearly beneficial. But look at how long it took for change to happen from the 1930s to the late 1970s. So even though there was hard data that having parents on the ward would reduce the rates of infection, the beliefs got in the way. So this is from an article by Harry Bachwin, 1942. An important measure for preventing hospitalism is the presence of the mother. Where it is necessary to keep a child in the hospital for any length of time, the mother is invited to remain with her baby all day if possible and to minister to his wants. This has worked very well. Contrary to what might have been expected, the free manipulation of babies in the presence of parents in the ward has not increased the incidence of infections among the babies. Indeed, there's been a decrease in cross-infections. Since 1930, when an active campaign directed toward satisfying the psychological needs of babies in the infants ward at Bellevue Hospital was instituted, the case fatality for infants under 1 year fell steadily from 30 to 35% to less than 10% in 1938, where it has remained ever since. It is interesting to note that most of the fall in mortality had taken place before the introduction of chemotherapeutic and antibiotic agents. So pretty cool, huh?
Carol, we have a question.
Yeah.
I mean, it's back to the videos. So someone was wondering about the studies in a less black and white setting. These children look to be in a very clinical setting, possibly without much interaction. What about children left with a father or close relative who may interact in a similar manner as a mother? Are results similar?
Well, so the reason that it looked like that is because this was at a time when germ theory had just been understood. So the rate of infection and death in young children was extremely high. And children in institutional care, like orphanages or hospitals, were dying at the rate of 30 to 35%, all the way to 100% back in the early 1900s. So the remedy was to do this very sterile kind of care. So there wasn't a lot of interaction, there weren't toys, people wore white coats, and the mortality rate went down, but the emotional disturbance went up. So that's why it looked like that in this placement. I don't know what the placement was. I know some of the reasons why kids were there, but I don't know what the placement was. Some of the next piece we're going to look at is children placed in hospital because, in nursery care because their mother had a baby. So there was a dad, there were other people, but it was just so considered the mother's job, at least in this middle class sample that's, I think, being represented here, that it just didn't occur. There's a film called John, 10 Days in a Residential Nursery that I used to show a lot. And people would get so angry at the dad because the dad would come in every day to visit the kid and he wouldn't take the child, and the child was falling apart, but not when the dad was around. So I always say in the dad's defense, that they only see what's happening when they're there. But for young children, not having them there is what makes it all fall apart. So.
There's one more question, and I think back to the other question. So I'm wondering, do you know if there's any studies with kind of this idea of children left with the father or close relatives and what the results are? Or, I feel like you're alluding to the fact that, of course, if it's with a father, that relationship can be there by the idea that these fathers visiting it show that they.
But also, we know, I think it wasn't as well understood then that babies
Right.
can have attachments. They didn't use the language of attachment at all.
Right.
But we know that it's the quality of the relationship, not the gender.
Right.
That makes the difference. So I don't know that, so little was done with dads back then, which is one of our continuing problems. We talk about maternal child relationship, maternal depression. So much of the research is as if the dads don't matter. So this is a clinical issue, I think, for a lot of us, is to make sure that we're thinking about the importance of the dads in all of this, including if they're not there, how important that is to the baby.
Right. And then the other question, in terms of adoption, when the parent cannot be given back to the child, rather replaced by an adoptive parent, how can we best help infants and toddlers to process the grief they're feeling? And how best can we help prepare adoptive parents to help their children process the loss? What are your thoughts?
Well, I think this is a really significant one. I hear this from adoptive parents regularly, that the baby, at least the parents who are adopting internationally, I'm guessing that that's what this referred to, not people who are adopting newborns. Wouldn't you say, Ariel?
Yeah, I would agree with that.
So what I don't think people are really prepared for, that the babies may have had a relationship with someone else and that they are actually experiencing loss. I think there's an idea that has been true for a long time, that babies in institutions didn't have one-on-one care, and so they just have to learn how to connect. But a lot of babies are coming having been with someone, and the smell and the sound and the feel, all of that is what babies are looking for, is where is that? Where did that go? One parent told me about spending about 3 months, I think she said, holed up with her husband and this baby who was about 18 months, who just cried all the time. He could not. And now, thinking about what we just saw, of course, they can't accept another substitute. One thing to think about with the Spitz film, though, is that this was before they thought that a substitute parent could be possible. So we're going to see that in the next one with John Robertson and the change that he introduced. Okay. Well, so here's, in that film, here's chapter 3, The Cure, Give Mother Back to Baby, and then you watch the little children come to life again. So Bowlby, John Robertson worked with Bowlby at the Tavistock Clinic in London. Together they changed how we see the way that children adjust to separation. They identified this sequence of response, which I think we probably are familiar with from graduate school. Do you remember this? Protest, despair, and detachment. So protest is the objecting to the separation. Right? Very active. Despair is the sad, is the dejected, sad, and then it's when it's the detachment, the loss of interest, the loss of who cares, I don't care. That's when it's really hard to regain, to reach that child who said, like, all right, I've given up. So they did a series of films of just watching the process of what happens when a child loses, a young child loses a parent. And we're going to see a clip of the last one. A 2-year-old goes to the hospital. Oh, I'm sorry, we're not seeing that yet. So the Robertsons' work on separation began when James joined John Bowlby in a study. The task was to document the responses of young children to separation from their mothers. So he obtained permission to observe these children. And what he found is that while they were adequately cared for, they were overwhelmed and bewildered by the experience, particularly those under 3 years of age. They became desolate and withdrawn, a near universal emotional response that had been largely ignored by the field. That's why I quoted this, because of that phrase. And during this time, we became determined to find a way to help humanize pediatric medicine. So I love what this guy did, and that research really makes a difference. He identified something. He said, this is a thing. No one's talking about it. Nobody's understanding it, and said, I'm going to do this. So he made these films and showed them. I've read some of the reviews of when they showed the films, and it sounded like it was kind of like a mini riot. You know, people were so upset, and they must have done this, and they must have planned it. And like, it's just hard to see what is actually happening. So here's the 2-year-old. It's just a clip of this. And it's not, well, I'm not going to say whether it's upsetting. I don't think that's fair to say to you guys.
Seeing this little girl sitting by herself, quietly clutching her teddy and her baby, it is easy to believe that she has settled in. She does not cry or demand attention. But see what happens when the nurse comes at playtime. Today it takes longer to make contact, and although the nurse tries hard to cheer her up with toys, Laura doesn't respond. Soon her feelings appear. No, don't. She asked, "Why is that boy crying?" and immediately burst into tears. Again, she says, "I want my mummy."
We have a couple comments and a comment and a question. So someone was talking about how it almost goes from anxiety to depression and grief. This process between being, I'm assuming the extreme crying to completely disconnected from the need for their parent.
Are you referring to those 3 stages? Is that what you mean?
Yes.
So just a different way to think about it.
Yes.
Yeah.
And then someone asked, what year is that video from?
I think it's 1952. It's in the 1950s. I don't know exactly. I can't remember that one. So I'd like to do this follow-up, because this one now starts in the 70s, or I think early 70s. Prior to the release of the films Young Children in Brief Separation, the prevailing and controversial theory of separation at the time was, so this is interesting, acute distress is the usual response of young children between 6 months to 3 and 4 years of age to separation from the mother, regardless of circumstances and quality of substitute care. Also, by implication, there is no distinction between the responses of these infants at different levels of development. Now, isn't that interesting to think about? The Robertsons, John and his wife, and I don't remember her name, resolved to clarify this issue. And in order to achieve this, they became foster parents to a series of children while making written and filmed observations. So they did the one-on-one picking up of the parent relationship. These children did not show any signs of acute distress or despair during the separation and were reunited successfully with their mothers. Right, so how's that for dedication? They're just going to become foster parents while they're doing their research to prove that the quality of care matters. So we know much more now. We know why being separated is so harmful. We know about effects on the attachment system and what happens when the child does not have that regulating partner. We know about brain development and how brain wires in response to stress. We know about how the stress response system can get activated, and by repeated activation, it can become overly established. We know how it affects learning. We know how it affects cognition, because if you're always on alert, why do you care about math? If you're always waiting to see who's going to take care of me, how do you learn about colors? We know about mood, regulation, and then how that affects relationships in later life, and parenting in the next generation. And so right now, as I said earlier, that researchers are looking at survivors of massive trauma and epigenetic effects and how it is passed, whether it is passed down intergenerationally. They know that it shows up, but there's all kinds of research, both on physiological changes, emotional changes, parenting changes. It's totally fascinating, but unfortunately not for this talk. All right, you guys, we're going to take a 10-minute break. Does that sound good, Ariel? We didn't talk about how long the break should be.
Yeah, that sounds great.
Okay. All right, and please feel free to write in comments, reactions, questions, whatever you'd like. Also, if we were in person, I'd be asking you about pacing, but you can write about that too. Okay, bye.
Everything's looking really great, Carol.
Oh, Rachel?
Yeah, hi, everything's going great.
Oh, I said some things that are stupid, but you know.
No, not at all. I have never seen those, the Spitz films before, and those were fascinating. Thank you so much for incorporating those.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
All right, well, I'm gonna go check on my kids, and I will be back in about 10 minutes then.
Hey.
Hi, Carol. People are just writing in to let you know they can still see you and hear you. I just want you to know. A couple of people wanted me to tell you that.
Ooh, how can that be?
I think
Right.
if you want to mute yourself for the break, you can do that.
How do I do that?
I can go ahead. If you hover over your picture, you should be able to see the mute button, or at the bottom of your screen. You can mute your video and your audio if you'd like.
I'm not looking at it at all at the moment, so I'm not sure how to find it again.
Zoom icon.
Yeah, but I'm doing the Zoom icon. Nothing's happening. Oh, shoot.
It's okay either way. We just see you.
No, but I can't figure out how to get back on, is what I'm saying. You see me now.
Yeah.
How do I get off? Say it again. What am I looking for?
You have a Mac, right?
Mm-hmm.
At the bottom of your toolbar, the Zoom should still be there.
Mm-hmm.
The icon, can you click it?
Yeah, I just did.
Nothing's happening.
Mm-mm.
Can you right click it or like double to show the bar?
Yeah, now I see it. Okay, what should I so click hide or
At,
what should I?
at the top, if you click Zoom meeting, you should be able to open it up again. That's
No,
what you're hoping to do.
getting Zoom meeting. Okay. Oh, stop video, mute audio, all that.
Yeah.
Okay.
We'll see you in a bit.
Ariel, are you there?
I am.
All right, do I have everything up the way it should be?
I can see you. I don't see any PowerPoint yet.
Okay, so something happened. I have to. There's got to be an easier way to do this.
Technology is a blessing and a curse.
Start share. All right. I thought we were already sharing. There we go.
You are there. I see the slideshow.
Are people on?
Everyone should be on, yes.
Okay. So are people back, do we think?
I do, yes.
All right, and then we're going to start again. We're going to shift tracks and we're going to think about specifically what happens at different times in development and how the capacities affect how a child deals with separation and loss, and also how it makes it more complicated depending on the stage. Because with developing capacities, we also develop ability to scare ourselves and feel like we're responsible for things. So that's what we're going to do next. Feel free to write in. So we know that separation, we've already seen, has a devastating effect on young children. We lose the attachment partner, our developmental partner, loss of safety, loss of comfort. And this combination, as you saw in the faces of those babies, of grief and trauma combined. So what we're going to be thinking about is what capacities does the child have? How did the separation and loss occur? What did the child see? What was the child told? And then who's available to help, okay? But so first we're just going to start with infants. We're just going to think about our earliest months and everything we know about what it's like to be an infant, what it's like to have an infant, remembering our theory and our practice that our self is developing through the relationship with significant caregivers, right? You know that phrase, there is no such thing as a baby. The self is developing through the relationship. And all of our parts, our touch, the way we feel, the sounds, the rhythm, it's all part of the developing attachment system and that co-regulatory partnership. So my sense of self is organized through my interactions with my attachment partner, through repeated, consistent routine, through gaze, through touch, through sound, through smell. I learned to develop a preference for my people because my people are familiar and comfort me. I learned to signal for them. They learn to respond to my signal. Over time, we develop this system. Inside of me, I develop an expectation that when I have a need, I know how to signal and it gets taken care of. And then I am comforted and I calm down, and then I'm interested in play. I'm interested in the world. As long as my needs are cared for, then my system can relax and I can be interested. Right? That's how it works if everything's going typically. So they've learned to plug into somebody in their first year. That's kind of our task of the first year, is creating relationship. This is theories of Daniel Stern, right? Creating relationship to plug in so that we can be ready to go to the second year where we learn to move out on our own. So what happens if our the socket is missing? The connector is missing. So if our caregiver disappears, it is confusing. This connection is vital and essential to our well-being. And so I did write, what if things don't go typically? So if a baby is not already connected in a secure way to someone, hopefully they're connected in a pattern, even an insecure pattern is better than no pattern. And they will recreate that pattern with someone else if there's somebody there. If they are in a pattern that is where they don't have a connection, where it's disorganized, they don't have a pattern, things are already challenging for them, it's going to be very hard for them to get comfort from somebody else because they're not used to being comforted. So if they're in a secure attachment relationship, it's going to be hard and confusing. And if they're not, it's going to be hard and confusing, but in a different way. A parent is really in many ways an extension of the child's biology as that child is developing. That adult who's routinely been there provides this enormous stress buffering effect on a child's brain at a time when we haven't yet developed that for ourselves. There's really one organism in a way. When the reliable buffering and guidance of a parent is suddenly withdrawn, the riot of learning that molds and shapes the brain can be short-circuited. Right? Does that make sense? So it can be short-circuited because attention is now toward finding comfort. So the buffering is gone. Instead, it's the agitation and arousal and the orientation toward I need to figure out how to be comforted, which actually as an infant isn't my job to figure it out. So loss, separation, which feels like loss, impairs development. This is a photo of that little girl who looked so mournful. We lose vitality, we lose developmental momentum, and we can regress from skills we've already achieved. The inability to find comfort it's not able to be verbalized because we're too young to even be able to say this discomfort I have is a question I need to ask, where is mommy? It's a felt experience. So mourning is an unnameable loss. And if it's unnamed, unresolved, and goes on, as we know from our earlier slides, it can affect our whole development and our relationship development. John Bowlby wrote about the infant, he does not know death, only absence. And if the only one who can satisfy his imperative need is absent, she might as well be dead. So overwhelming is his sense of loss. And that's what we mean by a baby can't tell us in conceptual terms. They have no idea. They've only been on the planet for 6 months, 8 months, 12 months. But that's how it feels.
Carol, I'm kind of thinking about how this manifests in children in different developmental stages, but what it looks like when they're telling us these things, because they can't verbally tell us, but they're definitely telling us. So what are some ways we might, or some things we might see or cues that they're sending that tells us this?
Mm-hmm.
Then I'm just thinking from my personal experience working with preschoolers, a lot of times we become really disconnected from the behaviors we're seeing and thinking that they're just behaviors for multiple reasons, but it really can be something like a loss or separation.
Mm-hmm. Well, so right now we're just going to be thinking about infants. We're going to do toddlers in a second. So just thinking about infants, one of the things that we notice is the loss of basic interest. So babies, that when they're satisfied, when they're just doing fine, they're interested in things. They focus, they concentrate. They are, that wake alert state. When they're stressed, they are seeking comfort. Sometimes they fall asleep. They knock themselves out. They are not available for learning. So when somebody has shut down, or if they've achieved some skills and then they start to lose those skills, so we see like lack of interest in play, lack of interest in food, too much sleeping or not enough sleeping if the body is stressed and can't relax. So very physiological for the young infant. Okay.
Thank you.
So let's think about as the baby starts to move into becoming a toddler, then they start to take on capabilities. They're able to move away and then return to their people. So by doing that, they learn that people are there even when they can't be seen. That's an exciting developmental phase. They learn to do things for themselves, even though it's clunky, but they become more physically autonomous. They get more of a sense of, I do it for myself. They're developing communication and developing this back and forth from the proto-conversation of the infant to actually saying, no, my turn, me do it. They are learning to connect with others through language, beginning to have empathy if they're raised typically. They're beginning to think about when I'm crying, a toddler might say, "You sad?" and pat me. Beginning to have their own ideas, which is interesting because when they have their own ideas, that's an Ann Garrity phrase. I have my idea, she would say about a toddler. That means that they're starting to say no to the parent's idea. So they're starting to resist the parent. They're starting to get mad at the parent who wants them to do their idea. They want care and comfort, but they want it to explore at the same time. They want to do it their way. They want to do it. They don't want to do it. I want you to hold me. I don't want you to hold me. We start to feel some of the conflicts in their desire to do it themselves, but still need a lot of help from the parents and the caregivers. And they're beginning to identify with parents, beginning to do what the parent does, beginning to imagine once they get that capacity. So we start to feel that it's much more of a moving into the social world, moving into the imaginative world, the communicative world. So the meaning for them is different because they are, yes, missing the basic physical loss of comfort and soothing, but they're also losing the bigger sense of how the world works. I want mommy, mom. I know that if I hide and mommy, I turn around the corner, mommy is there. Why is mommy not there? The disappearance leaves this sense of emptiness or torn edges, like we're a unit. I know how to find you. I go find you. There you are. It relieves my distress. Now I go find you. You're not there. So we see that seeking or searching behaviors or look on the face or signaling. Toddlers' two biggest fears is being left. And the other biggest fear is making a parent mad. And so maybe I caused you leaving me because I said no. So how do I become autonomous, independent, and while I'm afraid that that has made you leave me? So we see with toddlers that they may cope by shutting down, becoming mute, losing interest, really losing skills, becoming more helpless than they would have been. In one of the Robertson films, which is of this little boy in a residential nursery for 10 days, he's 17 months. In the beginning, he is eager and excited and he wants to play and he's very attentive and watching. By the end of the 10 days, he is lying on the ground covered by a big teddy bear. And that's all he did. That's what we mean by regressing, losing interest, losing skills. His whole self was oriented toward comfort that he couldn't find. And so that's all he did. So let's think about preschoolers. So when it goes typically, now we get this explosion of language and imagination and friendships and relationships and emotion expression, being able to regulate sometimes, not always, but sometimes. You know, I wasn't invited to a birthday party and I cry, but then I'm okay and I go on. And we also see in preschoolers that their fears and worries can increase because now that they can imagine things. They can imagine bad guys, they can imagine ghosts, they can imagine monsters, that they have feelings on the inside and they externalize it and they imagine. So they've now got access to representational play, symbolism. They can work out things because they can do a give and take. And then over time, as they get a little bigger, they start, you know, that phase of when a kid goes from 3.5 to 4, and they start to do the superhero play, like I'm the strongest, biggest, that omnipotence is a way to manage the fact that they're actually out in the world. They're really only this big, but they develop this use of competence and omnipotence so they can manage their fears. Right? So that's in our typical development. So with separation, oh, I'm sorry, I should have said this. I don't know how this got on this later side, but throughout early childhood, children use the mind of the parent to understand the world. So whenever they're encountering something that's surprising, what they do is they look toward the mind of the parent to find out, is that something that I should be concerned about, or can you explain that to me? And then the parent naturally, unconsciously just says, oh, that's the doggy barking outside. And then the child looks to the source of surprise. So when a child is separated from familiar comforts, the where's my mommy part of it is, could somebody explain to me what's going on? Toddlers and preschoolers cannot make sense of strange change themselves. They have only been on the planet a short time. All they feel is the stirred upness, and they don't have the usual mechanism through the mind of their parent to make sense out of it. So when that happens, then they're confused, filled with feeling. Confusion breeds feeling, anxiety, and anxiety breeds symptoms, what we might look at as acting out behaviors or regressive behaviors, but it comes from not being settled, not being able to settle. I don't know what's happening. So the developmental stage affects how the child interprets the experience of separation. This is going back to that older preschool age. The self-focus in early childhood puts the child at risk for thinking she or he caused the separation. Something I did made mommy or daddy not stay here or come and get me. So they make meaning with what they have, and their world is only this big when you're a preschooler. So what are they thinking? Like, did I do it? Did I cause it? Did I not prevent it? I could have. I'm strong. I'm tough. I'm a superhero. Did I make you mad? Was I bad? Was I not good enough? You notice that what's in common is the I. They don't know enough to know that there's a bigger world happening outside of them. And then when kids don't know, they make up what they don't understand. So over time, what's unsaid can get into the child's development and become a thing that just is how it is. Experiences can be encoded as erroneous conclusions. So some of the kids that I've worked with, one example was a little girl who I met at 9, but she told me, her name, we're calling her Peggy, she told me that her mom and dad had divorced. She was 9 and she's telling me this. But the reason that dad left the family forever and never came back is because she had a pacifier and she took it out of her mouth and threw it on the floor, and he got so mad that he left the family. That's a 3-year-old way of thinking. So that was her explanation at age 9. Another child had this unfortunate experience, which I think is not way more common than we know. A child acted out. In this case, he refused to kiss his daddy goodbye. He just didn't feel like it. And dad got detained that day. And he really was stuck in the belief that he had caused it. If he could go back and do it over, he could change what happened to daddy. You know, the magical thinking, it was because I didn't kiss him goodbye. So filled with guilt for not kissing him, but also guilt for causing it. Another piece we want to think about is the role of anger in these kids when there's been a separation or loss. So a Bowlby comment, when a relationship to a special loved person is endangered, we are not only anxious, but are usually angry, as responses to the risk of loss, anxiety and anger go hand in hand. It is not for nothing that they have the same etymological root. So it's interesting to think about. In attachment language, we think about rage and fear living really close to each other. So fear, anxiety, rage, anger, living right next to each other. If I can't get comforted, what I feel is anger. So fear of the unknown, fear that I did it, fear that it was something I could have prevented. It can erupt in anger, it can erupt in aggression toward the person who is there. I think we hear a lot about that in divorced couples. When one of the parents is gone, that the child is angry with the parent who's there, or angry at the parent who left, angry with the self for not being big or brave enough, especially if it was something involving police or something active where they felt like they should have, but they didn't. And then the behaviors that we see could be a manifestation of anger. In this case of one little girl, she was afraid to go to sleep because if she fell asleep, if she started to go to sleep, she could feel it. And so she would keep herself awake because she didn't want the angry feelings to come out. You know how little kids think they're so big they could break the building down? But part of our work is helping them know that nope, grown-ups won't let them break the building down. They can be mad and nobody will let them break the building. But sometimes it's hard to connect what the behavior is with this, with the sense of anger. So we get complicated thoughts and feelings in preschoolers. We get that mixture of, I don't really know how to do more than one feeling at the same time. Maybe I caused it all. Am I bad if I play? I'm supposed to be sad because daddy is in another country. Am I bad? Does it mean I'm forgetting? Am I bad if I forget to be sad? Or I was mad today, so does that mean somebody else is going to leave? Or I had a little girl who would talk about this. I don't want to grow up because mommy will think I forgot her. I don't want to love anybody else because it means I'm disloyal. I don't want to be sad, but I don't want someone to be mad at me for not being sad. Can I be happy and sad at the same time? All kinds of mixtures, which is why it's so useful for us to just know development so that we can try to predict the kinds of things that little kids are working through in their minds that they can't put into words. So before we go on to this, are there any comments, Ariel, that we want to address?
There aren't any comments coming up right now. The one thing I'm thinking about, and maybe I'm jumping too ahead, but thinking about things that we say to children in these situations when we're realizing they're having these thoughts or these feelings of, like, for instance, with the 9-year-old girl who felt that it was her that caused her dad to leave. What kind of, I mean, even just an example of something you might say or ways to address that. Even some of these statements here, it's, do we address them when they come up, or do we think about them in development and address them maybe because we think they're coming up?
Yeah, no, that's a beautiful question. I think that is exactly why I'm talking about this and trying to put these things in the words. Little kids cannot tell us this. So we see it in behavior. And we say, oh, sometimes some kids think that if they play, it means that they're forgetting their daddy. You know that I'm pretty sure daddy knows that playing doesn't mean that we say it because they don't necessarily, some kids will, and you guys know who work with young children, if we say something stupid, they'll correct us. Like, no, it's not that. And like, oh, so what is it? Well, and then they tell us, but I go with the belief that some kids think or some kids feel is really, really helpful because they don't know how to say it. We'll see some, like if you see a child who has experienced a lot of trauma or a lot of loss, who is sitting by the side of a playground and, maybe 3 or 4-year-old, what do we surmise is going on in that child's mind or body? I don't think they would know how to say to somebody, I don't know if it's okay for me to play. But if I were to sit down next to the child and say something like, so it looks like you're sitting here, and the child says, yep. And then maybe we talk a little bit about things that the child likes to do. Yep. And I can see you don't feel like doing it. Nope. Some kids might wonder if it's okay to play when their daddy's in another country. And maybe the kid doesn't say anything, maybe looks at you, maybe says, that's the stupidest thing I ever heard, or maybe gets up and plays. So should we go on, do you think, Ariel? Or?
Yeah, I think the only other comment that came in is just that it's really helpful to make the connection between being so little and wanting so much powerful or being in control of the situation.
Yes. So those of us who've worked with 4-year-olds, it's kind of stunning, the stuff. I mean, yeah, I read the literature, but I also have been working as a clinician for a long time, and I can think about a kid for every one of these. But one that really stands out was a little guy who knew his dad was going to have surgery. And he came running in one day, and he had a superhero costume on, and he had a big fist, and he said, "If anybody touches my daddy, I'm going to punch him in the face." And he just was all puffed up because you're not going to hurt my, you know, the kid was like this big. You're not going to hurt my, I mean, you watch the puffiness because I love my daddy so much and I'm so worried and I don't know that they're going to do a good job. And so we say, you love your daddy so much and you don't know if the doctors are going to do a good job. And you want to make sure they're going to be really careful with your daddy. And then we watch how they can go back to being little when they know we get it, you know? Or let's write those doctors a letter so that you can tell them just what you want them. You know, we get out our markers and let's write those doctors. Yeah, really important. Okay, so this is the portion when we're going to talk about different kinds of experiences of separation and loss, including traumatic ones. So it was hard to write because of everything I was reading, and I'm sure it's going to be hard to listen to. So know that I know that, and we'll just take our time to be careful. So we know that not all separation and not all loss is the same. And for families and community, that makes a big difference because for some kinds of separation and loss, there's a rallying that goes on. And for some kinds of separation and loss, there's an othering or an avoiding of the family. So we have different ways that separation happens or loss happens. Sudden versus planned. When you know that there's going to be a deployment and you have some idea, it might not be exact, but you have some idea, you can do preparation. When there's a crisis and a soldier has to go, you can't do that. You know, so sudden versus planned is very significant for the child. If something is ongoing, that's one thing. We know that it's going to continue for a while, have an end or not. Intermittent, if you guys know, remember from intermittent reinforcement ratio, that term for behavior conditioning. If it's intermittent, it's a very strong reinforcer for anxiety because it happens and then it stops, and then it happens again, and then it stops, and then it happens again. So for kids who are, for instance, in foster care, and they go for a while, they don't know for how long, then they're back at home, and then there's an unplanned amount of time, then they're out of home again, and then they're back at home. Really challenging. And ambiguous also when you don't know what's going to happen. There's a separation or there's an ambiguous loss. A parent is lost while being deployed. They don't know what has happened. That's really challenging. You don't have information to give to the child. There's blameless versus shameful separation. Blameless, something happened, you got hit by a bus, you ended up in the hospital. Everybody's like, oh, there's an accident, you got hit by a bus, you're going to be there for 4 weeks, and helps, everyone rallies around the child, versus something that we might think of as more shameful, such as maybe hospitalization for addiction. And I'm just making these terms up and I'm making these categories up. But so yeah, just thinking about how, under what conditions families rally for this, or the community rallies for this child and family. Noble versus wasteful loss. Noble for the child, it might not feel very noble if a policeman's father is killed while on duty, versus what someone might call a wasteful loss, maybe an overdose. But for the community, those are really different. And the child maybe is supposed to feel proud of the parent for being killed while on duty, which is probably not how they're feeling. Peaceful versus violent loss. Uncomfortable loss, such as suicide, where people don't really want to talk about it. There's a recognition that there's something uncomfortable, but don't want to talk about it. And then there's where it's unspeakable. where people are horrified and then can't address, can't talk about. Right? So this whole surround, this family community reaction are going to affect the adjustment of the child in the child parent unit or the child family unit, whoever is taking care of the child, the recovery from the event, and then how kids make meaning of it, because they may be told one thing, they may feel something quite different. There's an interesting article written in the 70s by Bowlby about children who found out how their parent died, but they were told something different. So maybe saw the parent who had killed himself, but were told that he died in the hospital, or a parent who had died by a violent death, they were told it was by illness. And so they did not trust their own internal reality because they were told that there was something else. And so I think some of these, they feel the same anger and pain, and being told that it was noble is a real challenge for making sense out of something. So I created this thing, continuum of experiences, thinking about maybe just, of course, there's a lot on the in between, but under the best conditions, long-term ongoing with foreknowledge, protected from overwhelming sights and sounds, no threat to the being or visible threat to the parent, stable support from consistent familiar people, and plain changes in routine and environment. For example, a parent preparing for deployment, right? Where nothing else is changing, no visible threat. Versus on the other end, some sudden violent death, exposed to overwhelming sights and sounds, threat or fear present, absence of comforting adults, sudden change in routine and environment, as a mom shot in a car when the child was there. So for the inside of the child, completely different, and how the community responds. Not all experiences receive the same support. In response to a question about the justification and impact of separating parents and children at the border, this was the response. General Kelly minimized the impact, saying the children will be taken care of, put into foster care or whatever. Right? So talking about where on that continuum this kind of separation falls.
Kara, would you say when we look at the continuum, you think of it different for each, like I think of the child on this continuum and where that support feels that should be, and then the parent, and then the community, and within cultural context, this continuum is going to be so different for different groups of people, different perspectives. Is that kind of, I'm just thinking like, and back to your previous slide too about how like I look at this list and I feel like noble versus wasteful could be completely different in two different cultural contexts. So right. Almost, I guess it's more of a statement of like, we can't really generalize what that might look like for a child or a family or a community that they're living in, especially a community that has a cultural context that we're not familiar with.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Oh, I think that's absolutely true. Mm-hmm. I remember talking with someone about, it was a home visitor, and she was in a home with a family from another country, and there was an idea that the young child was trying to hang himself, very young, like 3. And the story didn't make any sense. And we were talking about what was the meaning of hanging. And was it the same? The child wasn't actually hanging himself. He was acting it out. And it turned out that was a part of a traditional cultural thing that I would have had no idea had we not asked, and would have interpreted it one way, and the family interpreted it a completely different way. So I think that's an incredibly important point, that this whole continuum, of course, is based on us, right? If I live in a community where there's a whole lot of violence, there's going to be a continuum. It's just going to be the lower and the higher end is going to be completely different than if I live in a community where there isn't violence, and my lower and higher end is going to be completely different. The other thing about this continuum, of course, is we put in the age of the child. That is going to be very different depending on the age of the child, the kind quality of the relationship with the parent, whether this is an isolated or engaged parent with the community, you know, lots of factors to consider. So thinking about these aspects about separation, we think about how long, what happened next, how much change, were old routines kept, did changes continue, who were the people and who are the people now? And what we know is that it's the child's experience of closeness, not the biological name of the other, but the child's experience and the quality of relationship that makes the difference for the child. And previous experiences, of course, will affect current experiences. Is this a one-time thing for the child, or has the child's life had a lot of traumatic or dramatic events up to the separation? Have there been previous changes, previous traumas, previous separation? How about the family history? How, in the historical context, how much is rolling downhill from a long history of loss and trauma? Availability, quality, and consistency of community support before and after. When we think about traumatic separation, and so I'm not saying that all separations are not traumatic. I'm just saying that there is a difference between the traumatic separation from a parent and then the trauma that affects the inside, all those aspects of capital T trauma that we think about. Did the child witness overwhelming sights and sounds and smells? Was there anyone there for the child? Did it get embedded in the child's body and mind? How long did it last? How does the child make sense out of it? I'm not trying to say that planned separation isn't traumatic. This is a different quality, I would say. From Charles Nelson at Harvard Medical School, this is what happens inside children when they are forcibly separated from their parents. Their heart rate goes up, their body releases a flood of stress hormones such as cortisol and adrenaline. These stress hormones can start killing off dendrites, the little branches in brain cells that transmit messages. In time, the stress can start killing off neurons, and especially in young children, wreak dramatic and long-term damage, both psychologically and to the physical structure of the brain. The effect is catastrophic. So some of you may have seen this. This is from the Center on the Developing Child website.
Learning to deal with stress is an important part of healthy development. When experiencing stress, the stress response system is activated. The body and brain go on alert. There's an adrenaline rush, increased heart rate, and an increase in stress hormone levels. When the stress is relieved after a short time, or a young child receives support from caring adults, the stress response winds down and the body quickly returns to normal. In severe situations, such as ongoing abuse and neglect, where there is no caring adult to act as a buffer against the stress response stays activated. Even when there is no apparent physical harm, the extended absence of response from adults can activate the stress response system. Constant activation of the stress response overloads developing systems, with serious lifelong consequences for the child. This is known as toxic stress. Over time, this results in a stress response system set permanently on high alert. In the areas of the brain dedicated to learning and reasoning, the neural connections that comprise brain architecture are weaker and fewer in number. Science shows that the prolonged activation of stress hormones in early childhood can actually reduce neural connections in these important areas of the brain at just the time when they should be growing new ones. Toxic stress can be avoided if we ensure that the environments in which children grow and develop are nurturing, stable, and engaging.
So even when there is no apparent physical harm, the extended absence of response from adults can activate the stress response system. We certainly saw that in the Spitz films. Constant activation of the stress response overloads developing system with serious lifelong consequences for the developing child. Over time, this results in a stress response system set permanently on high alert, which I'm guessing that a lot of you have studied ACEs, but this is how we get these connections between early traumatic experiences and adult illnesses. In the areas of the brain dedicated to learning and reasoning, the neural connections that comprise brain architecture are weaker and fewer in number. We see lots of kids who have had traumatic beginnings who are later diagnosed with learning disabilities. So prolonged activation of the stress hormones in the child's could actually reduce neural connections at the time when they should be growing new ones. Yeah. A great deal of laboratory neuroscience research, including my own, has focused on the impacts of early life adversities on a developing brain. And maternal separation of the young from the mother is one of the more drastic adversities that's been studied. We know it can produce changes that are profound and long-lasting. That's what makes the decision to address a current political issue with a policy that can create lifelong change so concerning. So this is kind of, it feels akin to the Spitz and Bowlby letter to all of the experts saying the same thing, like this idea is permanently damaging. Overactivated stress responses may persist once the danger is past, once the child is reunified, because the wiring has already occurred. And so children may have difficulty distinguishing safety from danger because that stress response system is overly vigilant, overly aroused. They may experience the symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorders, such as intrusive thoughts and nightmares, intrusive feelings, avoidance, the hyperarousal, and then disrupted trust, disrupted relationships, disrupted attachment. And they're caught in an unsolvable dilemma. Young children who are separated from parents are clearly having stressful or traumatizing experiences. They may already be vulnerable because of previous traumatic events. And we know that the attachment relationship provides a protective buffer because of the regulatory function of the attachment relationship. So they don't have their regulatory partner, and the very trauma that they are experiencing deprives them of the one thing that could make it better. So, separation at the border. What does the young child experience? So on our continuum of planned versus sudden, we have forceful separation, and the absence of a substitute caregiver. We don't have the child going to care. Some kids have their siblings. Some siblings are very young. Those siblings are also children. They have lack of safety, protection, comfort, and changes in everything. Changes in what they're eating, how they're sleeping, what they're hearing, what they're speaking. And they're in that ambiguous state where it's unclear how long it's going to last and it has an unknown outcome. So they have no information to help them manage the distress. So it's really all of the risk factors we were talking about that would make it very, very, very challenging. Many kids who are migrating have already experienced a range of traumas. They may have been exposed to violence or threats of violence. They may have seen violence toward family members. They may have already lost family members or have already experienced separation. They have clearly lost basic basic comforts like shelter, food, safety. They may have experienced illness or injury to themselves. And one of the hardest things to think about, experiencing ongoing fright without comfort, ongoing fright without solution, ongoing fright without hope. So any comments about that before we go on?
There isn't anything coming through.
Okay, all right. So we're going to think about foster care. So we could do trainings on each one of these separately, right? So we're just looking at a rather shallow overview because foster care it's a huge experience. And one of the biggest differences is between the intent of foster care and the lived experience, right? The intent is to help the child do better, to help the child feel safer, feel more protected. The lived experience can be quite different. So foster care may be planned, it may be unplanned, it may be intermittent, it may be ongoing, it may have a known outcome, it may not have a known outcome. So it's got a lot of these things that contribute to that that risk part. More risk, an unfamiliar environment, caregiver sites, smells, food routines. They may retain childcare, they may retain extended family, but they may not. So they may have to adjust to new people, new kids. They may have contact with parent through social services or through social media. They may feel the tension in the foster home regarding the parent. They may feel a reluctance on the part of the foster parents that they aren't saying. They may not want to talk about it. They may not want to contact them. They may hear conversations between the foster parent and the social worker about visitation that they don't want to do. And they may feel an overall sense of disapproval or discomfort or uncertainty, but unsure why. Right? It's so much in the air when a child's in foster care that they don't know about. So much uncertainty. No? So I'll just go along unless you say something, Ariel. Should we do it that way?
Yes.
Okay. So military deployment. What does the young child experience? So often it's planned and it has a certain length of time, but there is an ambiguity to it with an unpredictable outcome. And of course, there's the danger in the air about where they're going. Whether it's spoken about in front of the child or not, children feel when there's something upsetting, right? So for deployment, they may retain housing, childcare, their caregivers, extended family. They may be staying where they are. Sometimes though, the other parent also moves. They may have contact through social media, and sometimes it's pretty frequent if it's a safe zone. And they may have social support. They may have frequent mention of the parent. They may get praise for being a child who has a parent who's deployed. And they may feel conflict between how they feel and what they're hearing from the outside. So that is that possibility that they're not quite sure what to make of all of this. So this is from some researchers in deployment. Our nation's military families know that separations and reunions of themselves and the children are profoundly challenging, even when they are opted into, even when they're anticipated and supported. Military families can teach us a lot about the cost. In the course of our research, we've talked to dozens of military-connected parents of young children about family separation. Their accounts highlight the resilience and coping abilities, but they also demonstrate the tremendous toll of extended separations. Parents describe intensive efforts to prepare their children prior to deployment and offer many examples of how separation affects their children. Loss of safety and security, difficulty understanding the parent's extended absence, difficulty accepting alternative caregivers, fear for the parent's safety, and increased emotional and behavioral problems. It's also painful for parents. They talk about their levels of stress and awareness of the moments and milestones they're missing. They worry about their kids' well-being and care. and how their children will manage their grief and fear. Despite the joy of reunification, great challenges remain when kids reunite. They describe reestablishing relationship roles and routines as an extended and complex process. It's even harder when family members are experiencing trauma symptoms or when a young child responds to the returned parent as a stranger. For some, the experience of relationship disruption lasts far into the future. Parents speak of continuing awareness that the relationship with their child has changed, the hard and sustained work required to establish closeness, and children who remain fearful that their parent will disappear again. It's interesting to think how similar that is to the evacuation reports. Not all aspects of the experience are stressful for everyone. Careful planning and strong supports help to ease the transitions. Usually, children remain in a familiar home with a parent or other loved and trusted caregiver, and daycare or school provides continuity. Right. So again, back to our stabilization, are aspects that make it not as hard and still very, very hard. So divorce and separation. So what does a young child experience? I think the hardest part is the difference between what the parent is going through and what the child is going through. So in the parent's mind, this is an imperative. This is something that has to happen. This is something that they would never do if it didn't have to happen. But the child is not having that experience at all. And so there is a clash in even the thinking about what this experience is like for the child and the parent. Ongoing, yes. Ambiguous, yes. It's very unclear. And the conflict over custody and time spent together can go on for a very long time. Children often feel torn between the two parents. They want one, they want the other, they want them at the same time. Sometimes parents don't want them to communicate when they're in one or the other homes. But the child's fantasy is that someday they'll both come together again and the child won't have to choose between one or the other. And sometimes we hear about visitation arrangements that from an early childhood perspective don't make any sense, like several months with one parent, several months with another parent, even when the children are very, very little, like 1 and 2. Not usual, but I've certainly heard it. So I'm not going to go through all of them. There's a whole range. Incarceration and separation is its own topic. Substance abuse treatment, hospitalization or separation because of parental mental illness. It's ironic, as I was doing this, I got a call yesterday from a colleague who was just wanting to process an experience she'd had with one of her clients who was going into the hospital, and they were talking about how are they going to explain this to this young child. And luckily there are grandparents, but it was so ironic or meaningful that it's right in the moment of this. The separation for financial or educational reasons, which happens a lot with international students and parents that we meet. Respite care, that was another thing that just happened recently, is someone was explaining to me about some of the respite care services she works for, and she said some of it is up to 6 months. 6 months, that's interesting. That's not how I think of respite, but that is what this service provides. Thinking about the parent timeline, sometimes people need a long time to get stabilized. The child timeline is quite different. What's that separation like? And then separation for termination of parental rights, which most likely had a whole lot of other things happen, including other separations before the final termination. All right, we're here at our second break. So go breathe, walk around, do whatever you need to do, and I'll see you in 10 minutes. Ariel, are you there?
I am. You're going to need to stop sharing your screen before you mute your video. I could still see your screen. There you go.
Okay. All right. Are we being heard by others?
Yes.
Okay, I'm going to turn off the audio. Bye.
Bye.
everybody there?
Yes, it looks like we are ready to be back.
Good. Okay. Can we just do a check-in on how people are? We get any feedback?
I have great exclamation point here.
Okay. You can say negative things too. That's okay. But great and here are terrific. All right.
Doing this, oh, we have a lot. Hold on a second. Doing
Okay.
well, loving the training, lots of wheels turning, overwhelming but important. Lots of info and processing, which is exactly how I feel too.
Okay, good. You never know how much to do and how I'm so aware of what we're not talking about that it makes me uncomfortable, but I'm glad that it's feeling like substantive enough for you guys. Okay, good.
Yes, and I will just mention, can I mention a couple more? There's a lot of comments coming in. One that just stuck out to me. I need to hear your whole training about the kiddos experience in foster care. I think I've heard too, just from others in the training, that this could be a series of trainings on these different topics that we're just surface level on. I think diving deep into them could be so beneficial.
Wow, yeah. Right, that's a great idea. Mm-hmm. And the intergenerational implications too.
Right.
That's all this new research that's coming out. Anything else?
Yes, I think a question's coming in, so I'm holding to see what that will be. But someone says, I'm thinking a lot about how to talk to parents and other caregivers about the child's experience.
Mm-hmm.
And then just the other one about using the, can people use your continuum that you showed on there?
Oh, I thought Ariel made a really good point. The question would be, how applicable would it be? I see what you mean. Like the idea about if there are certain stable factors and then the highest risk, I'd be happy. I'd like to put my head together with Ariel and figure out if we could make something that's a little more, I'm not exactly sure, but yes, that's a qualified yes. But we want to figure it out a little bit more. Is that okay?
I see what you're saying. This idea of the continuum can just look so different for so many different people. So how do we not overgeneralize, but still make it useful?
Right. So Ariel, will you be willing to work with me on that?
Yeah, of course.
Cool. Then, all right. And then you guys, once we have something, then sure. All right. Anything else?
The last comment I'm seeing is I can implement this in my career and personal life with my own children. And yes, yes.
Okay, well, here we go. I'm really glad to get feedback of any sort, you guys. I'm used to talking to people. So, okay, here we go. Risks and safeguards. So, as we know, right, we've been seeing all this. Who is available during and after separation? That's going to be one of the key factors. So separation and loss affect all people in the child's world. So one of the things that we know is even though there may be other beings, they may be emotionally connected to the missing person as well. So the physical loss of one parent sometimes creates emotional loss of the other, meaning that sometimes the remaining parent's despair could mean that they're not emotionally available for the child, or if it's a caregiver, maybe who was a grandparent, may be dealing with their own feelings about the missing parent. And a child may be stranded. So I remember a little 3-year-old saying, I'm a big girl, as she was trying to figure this all out herself. She didn't have anybody who could do it. But she said she could. Or someone that I've worked with for a long time, who she became the comfort to the remaining parent, even though her parent died when she was very, very little, and experienced the death of the father, which she experienced as desertion, and then the frozen grief of the mother, which made her mother unavailable as well. Another one where the child was told to take the place of the missing parent. I think that's not uncommon, but when you're 3 or 4, that's pretty, it feels very both significant and overwhelming because, you know, I don't drive and I don't have any money, but it's my job, and they take the job seriously, right? So if the grandparent becomes guardian, they may also be affected by the circumstance. I'm guessing a number of us have had families that have had this experience where the parent went to prison, or the parent was deployed, or the parent was deported, and who is left is the grandparent, who has a ton of feelings about the missing parent. It may be that the parent went to prison, and so they're ashamed of their child, or conflicted about their own ability to raise children, or angry at the system. But the conflict comes out about parenting the child. And I've had people say to me, I don't know if I did such a good job with my first, when they were grandparenting a child because the parent had a substance addiction issue and was not around. They may have difficulty acknowledging the child's emotions or allowing any negative thoughts if they are feeling guilty about parenting. One example was a little girl and her grandmother. The grandmother had had her since she was 2, and she was now about 7 when I met her. And she just was so guilty about taking over the parenting role for her daughter, who was addicted and was not able to be a parent. And she visited, and she was occasional, but she couldn't do the parenting role. And grandmother would keep Ileana at a distance because she didn't want to take over the parent's role. And another one was Annabelle and her grandmother, where grandma was ambivalent about doing this. She had already raised children. She didn't know if she wanted to do anymore. And so Annabelle felt that ambiguous relationship, you know, so her parent wasn't available and the grandmother was ambivalent. So safeguard. We need a reliable, consistent parent figure. So the recovery and return to normal, the normal developmental trajectory, is going to require a substitute caregiver until the parent returns. Whether it's the grandparent, whether if the grandparent can't do it, a child care person, but the child has to find someone to plug into. And so what we know is plugging into a new person is going to take lived experience, time, lived experience of consistency, lived experience of kindness. And the child may be protesting and rejecting because this is not the parent that they're missing. And it's the consistency of the responsive adult that can create that emotional connection and tap into the child's need for it so that the child becomes willing. You know, one of the pieces of research that came out of the Robertson work was that the young child, we talked about it, the young child will take on another substitute caregiver if it's consistent, available, and picks up the reins. They don't have as much difficulty as when there's either nobody, or there's a rotating staff of people, or there's someone who is not really willing but is there. The other piece is minimizing of as much change as possible, reestablishing of whatever routine was there for the child before the parent returns, and then keeping that routine once the parent returns. So risk, grief is hard to acknowledge. Grief is hard to talk about, just like anger, and old beliefs die hard. So a lot of people really think if we talk about it, it'll just make the child upset. So sometimes they're really telling us it's too hard for them to talk about it. The absence of the missing spouse, the child of the grandparent who might be deployed, it's hard to talk about. And it may be hard to tolerate the child's emotion, either toward the parent or toward the grandparent. You know, the adult may also be experiencing anger, even if the missing parent had nothing to do with the separation. But it's just hard to not feel it. And then how do you deal with both your and child's emotion at the same time? And they may be contradictory, or they may happen sequentially, but not at the same time. So there's a lot of challenge around that emotional support for a young child. So our safeguard is that experience and emotion can be acknowledged. Children benefit by having people who help them put their feelings and their behavior or their experience together. A lot of grown-ups don't know that their feelings and their behavior go together. And it's really important for us to know, so we can help children know that feelings and experience go together, or feelings and behavior go together, because kids just do better when they understand what they feel and why they feel it. They just can make sense out of it. That leads to resolution. Clarity leads to resolution, and confusion leads to anxiousness. Right? So experiences that overwhelm feel better when we can put them in order. We talk about trauma resolution. It's not about that trauma never happened or that one has forgotten. It's that it no longer feels like it's right here, and that it's the experience of recalling and remembering, but not re-experiencing it all the time. And emotions that can be expressed are easier to manage, and they're easier to let go. If I can tell you how miserable I am and how mad I am and how sad I am, and you're responsive to me, I can let that go. You may not solve my problem, but you're there to help me manage my feelings. So risk, many kids have to change their living situations when there's a separation. Maybe they are the ones who are being taken out. So caregiving arrangements change, housing may change, childcare provider and friends may change. If the separation was a result of something sudden or violent, they may not see the family anymore, or they may move to another country. So lots of change can happen, right? Kids really need consistency. Consistency, stable environment. It's necessary for recovery, safety and stability, predictability. That helps ground kids. Again, they do better when they know what's happening. They do better when they understand. And once they're stable, it's kind of like planting a tree, then they can reinvest in growing and learning again. So after the separation is over, after the change is over, I can settle my roots down. I can breathe. It's predictable. It's stable. And then I can grow and learn. So helping young kids reconnect. It's not linear. Development's not linear. Restoration of relationship is not linear. Fears are going to surface at unexpected times. Fears are going to surface at cues that they see on the street, smells that they smell, sounds that they hear, and they're going to process it when it comes up. And, little kids will just say right at the grocery store, like, my mommy went away, or my mom, they just say wherever it's going to be, and they will use play and behavior and language and art to show us what they're thinking and feeling, and it's up to us to catch it when they're showing us. We connect the behavior with feeling, which helps the child feel understood. And then we can help use our words, use our language to create organization in a child's mind. Organization, order, connection, it all settles us down. And being with the child in a non-demanding way just helps the kid feel less confused. Like, well, we don't need anything from that kid except we just can hang out. Helpful for the brain to just be able to relax.
We have a comment and a question.
Sure.
So one, someone just said, I literally see a 6-year-old boy whose growth charts show a flat line at the time of each of his 6 separations.
Right. Yep.
There's 2 other questions. So one, I fully agree that.
Ariel, can I say something about that?
Yeah.
Have you guys ever heard the line, Megan Gunner's line about how bodies can either defend or grow? It's a really useful thing to keep in your back pocket when we see a kid like that she's talking about, that 6-year-old. when the change comes, all the resources have to be directed toward, Megan Gunner uses the term hunkering down also. Like, all right, I can handle the stress, but you can't grow and develop at the same time. So that's really dramatic that's what this person sees. Okay, sorry.
That's okay. I think these two questions are really similar. One, I fully agree that old beliefs die hard, such as out of sight, out of mind belief that a child will forget if we don't bring it up. How would you help professionals understand this when they don't? What evidence can we offer for those who need an evidence base?
Oh, okay. It's interesting because I would, if I were dealing with professionals who don't believe that, I guess I would think about what we used to think and that what research has shown us to be true, is that the capacity to move things from the body into the language center allows us to process it and help it move out. But when things get constricted and shut down, they become more acted out. We see them more in behavior. Kids don't not show us. We might call it that a behavior kid rather than a kid who's demonstrating their distress. So I guess I might think of it in both of those ways, that we try to move things into language centers so they can be manipulated and thought about and talked about and allowed out. And then what the research tells us about stress and how it affects the developing person, even if it's not, it's all in there. I mean, is that helpful? I think I got a little bit mixed up at the end.
The other one talks about from the parent perspective. So can you speak to how to navigate situations in which a parent or caregiver simply doesn't believe that young children are capable of understanding reasons for separations, or if they're hesitant because they don't want the child repeating that information publicly?
Right. So I always talk with parents about what will be okay for you to hear being said out loud in the grocery store. That I always talk with parents about that we have to come up with a term. Well, so I guess the one way that I think with the parents is what it was like for them when they didn't know, because so many of the people we work with they're able to tap into their own experience and remember something and what it felt like when so-and-so just disappeared and they never heard about him again. And then they find out later what it was. And that feeling, when people can remember that feeling, it makes more sense to them why that might be helpful for their child. And the other thing is this idea that kids make up what they don't understand. And often parents can remember things that they made up, about things they didn't know. And once they realize that the mind is active, children have active minds. So we're trying to help them decrease confusion and increase their ability to connect how they feel with what they know. I do believe I really work with parents to find language that they're okay with, because otherwise the child can feel the discomfort. So I worked for a long time with a parent with really the most severe endogenous depression I'd ever seen. And the child was 2 when we started. The child's now about 6, and trying to come up with language that she was okay with about why mommy couldn't get out of bed, because child definitely needed to know. She knew that because she could see it, that she could see the fear and the concern, but she was also so worried about what people would think. So it took us a while to find language. The same with when parents go into drug treatment, helping the remaining parent come up with, and the parent who's going through drug treatment, what words are they okay with their child repeating in the grocery store? Mommy's in a place where grown-ups are going to help her feel better. Is different from whatever a kid's going to make up.
That feels so respectful to the process of the parent as well. Just thinking of differences in how we all believe. I mean, what I might tell my child's going to look different from the next person. And so having that individualized opportunity to work with a family to figure out what's comfortable to you. I'm not going to assume that one thing might be comfortable to you and the next person.
The other piece that's so helpful in both of these questions is the idea that we have to understand what a parent is fearing or wanting or thinking before we come up with suggestions or solutions. So I want to know if it's that the parent really believes a child does not have the capacity, I'm going to join them in that and talk about how everybody used to think that until this research happened. Like, absolutely, we all were taught that. You know, if that's a parent's belief, we all know that that was true. People used to think that. So if I know that that's where they are, we're going to, but if it's because they're afraid people are going to find out, that's a different kind of belief. And we're going to think about that like, oh, that makes total sense. Of course you don't want people in your business. Let's think about how you want the child to understand it that you're okay with.
There is another question.
Oh,
Someone's thinking about how childcare providers support children in their care experiencing separation when other children in care don't know about what the specific child is experiencing. So a child is showing behavior difficulties impacting the other kiddos. Are there ways to speak to or play with all the children in their care in a way that better supports the one child?
Well, that's interesting because look at my next slide, the teacher. I did not write this for group. I wrote this more for observations if you see a child who's either acting out or exempting him or herself. So I'm not going to, I don't have the one for the group because it's hard to think on my feet, you know, for that. But what I wanted to say was that you may know this child's story and you may or may not see changes in behavior or social interaction or emotions that you can connect, or you may, you know, we don't know. But we know that we've got to be on the lookout and we have to be thinking about triggers, what might be making the child withdraw, shut down, or becoming anxious and aggressive. And it may be long after the separation has passed. And so I've got a few examples, like for the withdrawn child, you may name the emotion. Sometimes it's hard to play when you feel worried or when you feel scared. I'm glad you're here so we can be together. Mommy will be here after nap. So it's not saying, oh, you're so scared that mommy will go away again. You just know that that happened. And it's hard to play when you feel like that. Here we are together. Mommy will come after nap. For the acting out kid, oh my goodness, you have a lot of feelings. You're so upset. Come sit with me. We can draw. We can read. It's hard to play when you're worried or mad. And now we're back to that. We can sit together when you feel like that. We can draw pictures. We can read a book. Let's show mommy the pictures when she comes to get you. So it's again, reassuring the child. Mommy will be here after nap. And for any child, anytime. Also, this is something maybe that's applicable to a group thing. I used to do this when I worked in childcare. Let's write a mommy or daddy a note so she'll know what you're doing or feeling. And then I'd pull out some paper and markers. So what should we write about? About outside time or about lunch? I'd start with, I myself would offer something neutral. And then the child could say, no, I want to write about when so-and-so wouldn't play with me. Oh, sure, let's write about that. Or I thought you weren't going to come. Let's write about that. You were worried you weren't going to come. And should we underline that? Should we fold it and put it in an envelope? Good, let's make sure we show mommy. Okay. Practice saying complex things simply. You get scared when mommy drops you off. So this would be for the screaming child. You worry she might not come back. Mommy will come get you. Name the feeling. You are so worried. You're afraid she won't come back. I can help you remember. Or my favorite, describe what you see. I see you don't feel like playing. You know, people always say, well, what do you say? I think you say what you see. I see you don't feel like playing right now. You feel like sitting on the step. How about I come sit with you? Sometimes when I'm worried, I like to read a story. Let's read a story together. So we're offering companionship, we're offering kindness, we're offering emotional intelligence. We're not interpreting or pressuring. We're just naming. Mommy, I'm afraid you won't come back. You are afraid she won't come back. I can help you remember she'll come back. She'll be here after now.
Carol, I kind of wondered just about the question about group care, thinking about saying complex things simply too for the other children. I think we get caught up sometimes in like we know the backstory and we get so worried about that. And so I wonder, like most children throughout a day are going to feel emotions, whether some manifest in a bigger way, but just like children have felt angry and sad and all of those feelings that this child who's having it more significantly is experiencing. So talking through with other children about that, I think, is a way we can do it, and really thinking about it more simply, and this idea that typically children, when we give them a really simple answer, they're going to be okay with it. The other children in the classroom, like, oh, okay, that child needs this child needs my attention right now, so if I'll have 5 minutes with them and then I'll come over to you, or something very simple. I think it can help ease the other children sometimes.
Yeah. Or a phrase we used to use, something about this child hasn't quite figured out how to sit at circle or at story. And you already know, so you're sitting and she's learning. That's okay, you know. Okay, I'm looking at the time. I see that we don't have much time left. So this was written thinking about the divorce and different kind of people picking up for on the whatever the next thing that has to happen for the child is, to maybe someone who is going to be deciding where the child's going to go, try to imagine the circumstances from the child's point of view, establish safety and stability as soon as possible, reestablish routines, kind and informed. I mean, it's really very much the same. And then if necessary, find a qualified therapist to help process the fear, loss, and worry. So I wanted to get to this. I wanted to make sure. So I know I don't know actually if most people watching this are in the therapy field or in education field, but I did want to explain what the process of therapy was like for people who aren't in the therapy field. Or maybe our parents, maybe who's watching this. So we have different modalities where some people will, for a young child, will be with the child and parent or the caregiver together. And that's probably the best modality right now, if it's a very young child, to be with the parent so that the parent and child can understand and make sense out of things together. But sometimes the caregiver can't manage the feelings. So we might see the caregiver and the child in different times, and then tell the caregiver in front of the child about the session together. But that's if the caregiver can manage. If the caregiver is going through his or her own grief and it's so extreme that they can't, sometimes it works better to tell the caregiver about the session later. We might see child and siblings together. We might see everybody, family, siblings, parents. And the therapy process is making sense out of what happened, getting a clear understanding of what happened. So you need permission from the caregiver to make sure that, just as we were saying, that the caregiver is on board with what we say, and the kind of language that we use fits what the caregiver is okay with being said in the grocery store, and a pace and language that matches the child's developmental level. So we use toys and drawings and books to tell the story. So here's an example. So we've got the police show up at the house. They're going to take the child from the parent. We include important details from the child's point of view, including the sensory details. So the siren, the sound of the door closing, the child was upset. Maybe there was a smell in the car from the police's cigarette. A simple narrative helps to demystify what happened. And then they came to a new house and there was a green car and a kitty. And they met these new people. A simple narrative helps to demystify. That's kind of our goal here, is to make it simple and not strange. We include feelings and people and we connect them to what happened. And so then they drove in the green car and they went to visit mommy. So we use simple terms to explain the scary, unknown, surprising parts. Whatever happened in the story. Met mommy in a new place. Back in the green car. Help the child understand what happened. Back to the house. And help the story come to an end. Because kids need to know that things end and then something else happens. Right? So as you tell it, you keep the story as simple as it is true. It will need retelling, and it won't be linear. And one thing that got me as I was laying this out is, do you notice visually what's the most pronounced thing here? To me, it's the green car. And so I was imagining that once everything is over, the parent got the kind of treatment she needed, they were back at home, this child may be triggered by the color green, or by a green car, or by a picture of a green car, or maybe a police car. I could imagine that that might get embedded in the child's body and mind. And as we tell it over time, the chaotic story becomes understandable. And then new questions and new feelings will arise, you know, so let's say they're out at the neighborhood where the other house was, and the child brings it up, and then they talk about that. Well, why did you have to go away? And the story will continue to emerge and reintegrate as the thinking becomes more complex. Right? So over time, we get a linear story, but it circles around, especially as development progresses. So let's
Carol,
look at,
we do have
yeah.
a question. One question is just wondering about how we can put this information into simple words so that we can share with families who are new to the country or who have limited understanding of child development.
If they're new to the country, they are coming from a whole set of beliefs about what's healthy for children. So the first thing I would want to find out is what they believe, right? Because then we can talk about what they believe comes from a long history. And then there is this new research, would they be interested in hearing about it? It doesn't mean that right? So that's, if I know someone's coming from a whole different culture, that's the first thing I want to know. And then we can think together about old beliefs, this kind of research-based beliefs. What do we think would be useful for their child? What would be okay with them? Because if the parent is rejecting, is so uncomfortable, nervous, feels like it's damaging, they're not going to be able to communicate that in a way that helps the child settle in. You know, I'm guessing that whoever wrote that in was talking about a traumatic event that happened to the child maybe before coming. I bet you don't know. Is that right, Ariel?
I do not know.
Yeah.
No, I'm not sure. If they want to type in and just mention it, they can.
But I mean, we see so many parents from other countries who've gone through terrible things. And I really like to know what they think, you know, how do they think about young children? What do they think young children can understand? Vast differences, I think.
There's another comment. And for me, when I think about this, these pictures, and you said, what sticks out to you most? The first thing that popped in my head was the police car. It wasn't the green car.
Oh.
So it's interesting, that perception of like we obviously have different perspectives. So this idea that for the child, it could be,
right.
I mean, we think about the trauma with children and the loud sounds and the lights and just thinking about that. But someone else had wrote, it makes child protection reporting very challenging when you like having to balance when to make one and when it can be more damaging to the child.
When you have to balance what?
When to make a child protection report or when it would be more damaging to a child.
I wish we could have that discussion. I'd love to hear what that person means. Is she talking about the fear of that it would result in the child being separated?
I don't know.
Yeah.
I wonder, yeah.
Because that is something that, again, we should do an extended discussion about. We can't do it right now, but I would love to have that conversation. And
then about the culture piece, talking about, yes, the trauma, cultural beliefs and trauma play a huge role in that. So yes, children with trauma. And all of parenting. Cultural beliefs, right? Okay, we don't have much time, so let me just finish up. So I just want to say that the meaning of these experiences will change over time. The reverberations
continue. So milestones may be experienced differently. And the thing I want to get to is that when there's been separations or loss, it lays an unconscious roadmap for the life course. So let's say I'm 2 or I'm 3 when this happens, and then I'm reunified and I grow up, and then I have a child. The unconscious tension may appear as I get closer to the age that my parent was, or my child gets closer to the age that I was. And so sometimes it's called a cursed year. So here's a quote: "For many who had experiences of separation or loss, one particular birthday in their adult years is highly anticipated and bittersweet. My mom was 44 when she died. My dad was 45. I just turned 46 in April. And it was a huge exhale for me. I had to live to 46 to break the curse." So the child's pathway evokes the parent's history and the anticipation of separation. And I learned this from parents. I didn't know this, but I would sit in parent group and people would say things like this woman, Willetta, who was talking about her daughter of being 12 or 13 and how she was going to have to throw her out of the house at some point because of her behavior. And I was just like, what? I just didn't get it. And she said, well, I had to leave when I was 14. Like, oh, okay. And then in that same period of time, this woman, Tanya, yelled in group. She said, well, I told her if she didn't clean her room, I have to send her to foster care. Oh, and I finally said, like, what age were you when you went to foster care? She said, I was 9. And how old is your daughter? She's 8. Ah, it's approaching. And then we've got Jenny. So Jenny started off kind of anxious. Her father died when she was a tiny baby. But when she was 6, she was separated from the family for an illness. Now she's an older woman, and I still can't make sense of the story because sometimes she says it was 6 months, and sometimes she says it was a year. And sometimes she says her mother visited like clockwork every 2 weeks and she had to take 2 buses. And sometimes she didn't see her mother. So I don't know. But I know that having children made her anxiety off the charts, and it has been that way. We talked about Molly a little earlier. She's the one whose father died when she was in kindergarten. And as her daughter was getting to kindergarten, she just, because it was going to happen, even though it wasn't, and it didn't. So that is just a common thing, just something for us to know. If there were separation and loss in early childhood, parenting evokes it. Separation and loss may remain the most indelible event in a person's life. This is from Oliver Sacks, the neurologist. And oddly enough, I was just reading this book, and this is what showed up in the book. Recently, I once heard a radio program devoted to the memories and thoughts of those who, like me, I didn't know this, had been evacuated during the Second World War, separated from their families during their earliest years. The interviewer commented on how well these people had adjusted to the painful, traumatic years of their childhood. Yes, said one man, but I still have trouble with the 3 B's: bonding, belonging, and believing. I think this is also true to some extent for me, which he wrote in 2015 and probably was separated in 1940, right? Wow. In summary, what do families need to heal? Know and tell the story, feel the feelings, turn toward each other for comfort, allow negative, remember painful and thoughtful moments, integrate negative and positive versions of the experience and ourselves. And this last one is really hard for some families, allows some to move forward even when others are not ready. And what do children need? Understand the story suitable for their development, connect emotion, behavior, and meaning, reassurance that they make sense, that their physical sensations have an explanation, reassure that they are okay now, they did not cause the separation, reassure about the now and the future, suitable explanations about the past, and permission to return to growing with time and repeated felt experience. And here are some supplemental resources, which I'm guessing we'll be sending you. But this has, there's a webinar. That's why I put this one on. This Thursday, February 20th, there is a webinar on the National Child Traumatic Stress Network site. I think one just signs up for it and it's free. Reflections on Engagement with an Immigrant Child Parent Dyad, recently reunified. The National Child Traumatic Stress Network has lots of stuff on separation in different kinds of separation, like we were talking about. Tip sheets for parents, handouts, videos, lots of things to look at for more information. All right, you guys, this is, I'm happy to just stay on if you have any questions or comments that you want to submit.
I was going to say there is a question, so I'm mindful of time. So if individuals have to log off, but I will read the question still that's here. So if anyone wants to hear, and I believe Rachel might have an announcement about CEUs. So I'm let her do that before we get to the question.
Okay, goodbye, whoever's leaving. Thanks for coming.
Yep, and I will quickly just say that CEUs in course or training evaluations will be sent at a later point before Friday this week. And again, you all have my direct email address on the webinar invite. So if you have any questions about anything, you can go ahead and email me directly. Additionally, I will be uploading Carol's PowerPoint and the supplemental materials into the Google Drive folder that I created. And again, that link was in the webinar invite. So again, look for those CEUs and those training evaluations to come at a later point this week. Thanks.
Thanks, Rachel. So the question we have, I'm going to try my best. I'm going to read it as is with the idea that this person may need to type more information. So I might not be interpreting it right, but
okay.
I have a disconnect between caregivers and families and belief of how to approach separation and loss. More specifically, I have two cases, one with foster care and one with father leaving the picture. These students are showing behaviors. The disconnect is between how to approach the child's behaviors. Some consider more of a need for structure, like we are not playing, and some think that they need more one-on-one kindness. You spoke of not interpreting. Often I see some considering showing kindness, and this time to de-escalate feelings is allowing the child to get away from behaviors. What are your thoughts on this?
So I'm guessing, I can't tell if this is regular childcare or maybe special ed. Do you have a sense, Ariel, or you don't know?
If the person who wrote that question wouldn't mind typing in, that would be great. I'm not sure.
But I'll say what I generally think about anybody, any kid with behaviors. Well, any kid, let's do it that way. High structure, high nurture. You know, the old preschool day treatment kind of mantra, high structure, high nurture. So we are structured, we do what we do, but we do lots of the connecting and the welcoming and the supporting. There are some kids who because they're too aroused, cannot go with the structure. And so for them to have separate time and so they can get regulated and then join when they can. I think that's, you know, it's part of it's why I was asking, wondering if this is a typical classroom or kids who have lots of difficulties.
Early Head Start.
Oh, Head Start, okay. So many of the kids in Head Start live very stressful lives. I don't want to make that as a blanket statement, but some of the experiences that they have prior to coming to the classroom have set their stress response system on hyperactive. And so having the guidance, the opportunity to regulate, the assistance to regulate so that they can learn, I think is really necessary. So I'm in the, I guess I don't think of it as behaviors so much because it's all coming from somewhere. So if it's coming from stress, have they had a sense of safety any place? Do they know what it's like to find calm in their brains? And can they do that one-on-one, maybe in reading a story, or one-on-one doing drumming, or one-on-one singing together? And then can they do that with two? Can they do, you know, like getting the regulation? If they're coming from high stress, then they have to have help because their little brains don't know how to get it. They don't know how to let down if they've been chronically stressed. So that's a supposition just because of the two kinds of questions you asked. But I think it is moving away from thinking about behavior for behavior's sake, as opposed, and I'm not saying the writer did that, it sounds like some of the coworkers might, versus behavior comes as an adjustment and an adaptation to something for a reason. And if a child has to be jacked up for a reason, it's going to be very hard for them to let it down for a certain period of time and then jack back up. So they have to learn how to do that in the context of the classroom.
Perfect. Thank you.
Okay. All right, you guys, thanks very much for coming.
Thank you, Carol. It was wonderful.
Bye.
All right, thank you, Carol. Carol.
Ariel, there we go.
And Ariel. That was an easier way to say it. It was a great presentation. Thank you both so much. And Ariel, thanks for stepping in this morning. I was really scared that I was going to have to run to the bathroom with one of my kids through the presentation. So
Yes, of course.
Do you know if people are hearing us now?
oh, they are. Yeah, we still have about 20 participants on. Yeah. But I will go ahead and end the meeting for us, unless either of you need anything from me.
Oh, I just realized I can see all of this. Here we go. Can I? No, go ahead and end. I'm curious to read some of this.
You know what I could do, Carol, is I could. Oh, I'm sorry, Ariel.
Well, if you end the meeting, I think all that will go away, huh?
It will, but what I can do, I can actually send a transcript of the chat log. If you would want to see the questions, Carol, or the things that people post during the training, I can send you a transcript of that.
Ariel, do you think that mostly you read it out?
I did. There were, I think, actually only 2 comments. I didn't get a chance.
Yeah, I see that.
Yeah.
No,
Other than that, yes, all the questions were answered, and yeah, I think everything, I kept up on all that. So,
and I also was seeing some names I recognized, so that was part of it. It was like, oh, look at that.
right.
Okay, are you still there?
Yeah, Rachel, do you know if you're able to end for participants, or does it just end the whole meeting?
It just ends the whole meeting,
Oh,
unfortunately.
listen to this one right here, right? This also makes you think about the intense amount of turnover in childcare professionals, especially for very young children. This is the thing that we keep saying is things that are happening right now that we don't pay attention to.
Right.
But yep, that's what we're doing.
Right.
All right, you guys, thanks so much.
All right. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.